Good evening, friends, and welcome to this another webinar of FIFA on, I think, on a very topical and very interesting subject. I would, at the outset, like to thank our esteemed speaker, Mr. Karan Datta, for joining us. He's been a part of our industry, and Karan has over 25 years of experience in the financial services industry and has held leadership positions at very elite firms like Goldman Sachs, Franklin Templeton, Axis Mutual Fund, and Aditya Birla. He has played key roles in business, sales, marketing, operations, and distribution. Most recently, he served as Chief Business Officer at Axis Mutual Fund. Prior to Axis, he was at Goldman Sachs Asset Management as the National Sales Head and at Franklin Templeton in sales leadership roles in Singapore and India. Karan, we all know, is an accomplished speaker and has been regularly invited to speak on topics such as national security, cost of terrorism in India, sports, and business. Karan currently sits on the boards of Edelweiss Asset Management, Prudent Corporate Advisory, and Tamora Investments as an independent director. So we are very proud and fortunate to have somebody who is not only an investor speaker, but a thinker and an independent director. He has had more than 30 plus collaborations. He's delivered more than 45 plus talks, and he comes with a very large and varied experience. I always have been fascinated by his decision to have quit such a promising career to, I suppose, pursue his passion. And clearly, I think geopolitics is one of his passion or the subjects. We earlier had him come and talk to us on what happened, on the India-Pak border. And it was really fascinating for me to hear his analysis and the role of China, India, Pak, and China, and how those things panned out. And therefore, today, I think what is happening in the globe, I think just three months back, I think at least I was completely unaware that there is, real problems surfacing in terms of the geopolitical environment in the world. And today it is more than a month that Russia invaded Ukraine and the war still continues. And I think all of us would be having conversations with our family, friends, and more importantly, our clients as to why and what is happening in Ukraine, how it would get resolved, and how it is more importantly going to impact the economy and our clients' investments. So I think it is very timely that we are having this session, and we could not have had any better person than Karan to address us. And I would like to personally thank him on behalf of all the members for sparing his time. He's just, I think, come in from an overseas trip. And therefore, I would once again thank him for taking this time out on a very short notice. And over to you, Karan.
Thank you. Thank you, Dhruv. Thank you, Rupa. Thank you, entire team FIFA, for allowing me to speak to you and, just kind of on a topic where traditionally everyone would want to call a specialist, but you all have allowed me to, speak to all of you. And I'm really genuinely thankful for that. My sincere gratitude. There is one thing which we were discussing before the conversation started, that in our industry there is a clear link between global events and markets, and certainly in the last 2 years that has got clearly established. It started with what happened at the time of COVID. And then Dhruv, you mentioned about what happened between India and China, Galwan, and now what is happening between the Russians and the Ukrainians. If you look at each of these events, they are geopolitical events. They are events of national security, but they have a direct impact on what you and Team FIFA do, which is advise on investments. And so one of the things I want to start by clearly stating right at the beginning, that as financial intermediaries, as financial distributors, as financial advisors, there is a direct linkage between geopolitics, national security, and what you do in your careers. Which is why roughly around 5 to 6 years ago, I developed this interest in this space. And fortunately, it's kind of held me in good stead, because as an investor, I'm very keen to know what's happening with my money. So if I don't know what's happening in the globe, it's very difficult to know what's going to happen with my money. So that background is very important, and certainly for this audience, it's really critical. And the more time we spend in understanding the globe, it just opens up our minds a little bit more to what could happen with our money. And that's that. I just thought I'll kind of lay that background. And today, what I'll do is kind of decode what is happening as far as this current phase of the war is concerned. But what is very interesting is that in less than 2 years, we've had 2 black swan events. Pehle COVID ho gaya aur ek war ho gayi. So what was supposed to take decades, like black swan events or these, absolutely out of the world events, were supposed to happen every 7-8 years, every 10 years. But interestingly, now white swan is starting to look very, very difficult to happen. अपने हर साल एक साल में black swan होने लगा, तो फिर तो white swan will become like a bit of a क्या कहते हैं, bit of a rarity. So we're passing through some very, very interesting times. And as we speak, literally right now, 3 o'clock, which is 3 o'clock Pakistan time, probably now as we speak, Imran Khan is going to be addressing the parliament and probably handing over his resignation, because the entire cabinet has passed a no confidence motion on him. So things just keep moving very quickly in politics right now. And with that background, I'm going to just do one thing. I'm just going to start with some slides. It's very important to understand the history behind this current conflict. If you don't understand the history, then we only tend to look at things from today onwards. It's very important to go back and see as to there must be some reason for this to have erupted and become what it has. And remember, all of this has massive economic implications. For example, what's happening on petrol prices, etc. So allow me 30 seconds. I'm just going to start my share screen, start with the slides. And at the end of it, I'd request you all to put your questions either in the question and answers, then then we can start answering that. So I'm just going to start my screen. Just 1 second. Is it visible?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, Karan. Yes.
Okay, so just 1 sec. Okay, so like I said, the purpose of this conversation is try and decode the Russia-Ukrainian war. And for that purpose, I would have to step back in history a little bit. And stepping back in history can go as far as 1,000 years, but I'm not going to do that. We'll probably step back about 50 odd years. Very important to figure it out, because if we don't get history and geography right, we'll probably miss the real issue behind this entire conflict. And at the end of it, I will try and give India's point of view as well, and we'll end it all with Q&A. So let me start with my first slide. I want all of us to go back in history and look at 1990. If we were sitting in 1990, this is the map we would be looking at as far as the Soviet Union is concerned. Please remember that as we speak about Russia, we don't speak about the Soviet Union. And I mean, I'm from the era where there were 2 powers, the United States and Soviet Union. So I understand a bit of the Soviet Union. I'm sure all of you on the call understand the power of the Soviet Union. Up until 1990, this is what Soviet Union looked like. Massive country, very powerful, called the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. But something happened post 1990, and we'll talk about it, that this map kind of looked very different post 1990. But I just wanted to start with this one particular map and show you the vastness of the USSR, of the Soviet Union. And every part that you see, every country that you see was actually well and truly part of the USSR. So this is 1990. And in 1990, not just this particular map, not just the Soviet Union, but even in 1990, the Soviet empire, so to speak, extended into East Germany, Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria. If you look at, now this is where I wanted to start with, that if you just looked at 1990, you looked at Soviet Union, but you also looked at the Soviet Union influence, because after World War II, there were two factions that got created. There was the Western Bloc, which is NATO, and then there was the Eastern Bloc, which was the Soviet Union bloc, called under the Warsaw Pact. So each country decided where they wanted to be. And if you look at all the names in the green, the English, the French, the Norwegians, Italians, they decided to be part of NATO. But all the other countries, Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, they wanted security by the Soviet Union, and hence there was the Warsaw Pact. The reason why I'm showing you these maps is very important to understand that where are we coming from. And I'm just going to repeat this so that we are all aware of where we are coming from. In 1990, there was a Soviet Union, large, supremely large country. Plus it had the Warsaw Pact, in which all these names were protected under the Soviet Union up until 1990. But let's just see what happened post 1990. As 1992 came, the Soviet Union collapsed. No, it didn't exist as Soviet Union at all. In fact, in 1991, after its collapse, 15 countries came out of Soviet Union, one of which is Ukraine. Number 13 in this list is Ukraine. So imagine in 1990, you are the boss, there's Soviet Union, and then you run the Warsaw Pact. You have countries under your security belt. But 1 year later, your own country gets broken up. 15 names come out of Soviet Union. 15: Armenia, Moldova, Estonia. In fact, Azerbaijan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, many countries that we visited as tourists, they were all part of the Soviet Union. One of them is Ukraine, and one of them is Russia. The 15th name is Russia. Of course, Russia is still the largest. 70% of the Soviet Union is still Russia, which is pretty large. But they lost 30% of their nationhood, and all of this in the 1990s. And the map started looking very, very different post 1991. So from the Vishalta of Soviet Union, it gets broken up. 15 nations come out of it, and this is what the new map starts to look. It is the Russia. It is still Russia. It's that, but that's 70% of what Soviet Union is. And look at how the countries got broken up. Estonia, Lithuania, Belarus, Ukraine, the country that we're going to talk a lot about, Georgia, Azerbaijan. I don't want to get into each name, but things that we take for granted, that ye sab to desh hain hai, were originally all part of the Soviet Union, and they've obviously become, and very rightly so, they chose to become countries because that was the choice given to them. And the Russians have accepted that fact. These countries have existed like that for the last 30 years. It's not as if that whole system is being questioned. Something has gone wrong between the Ukrainians and the Russians, that this war has got erupted, and we'll talk about it. But this is what the map looks like today. I'm going to show you a couple of more maps so that we understand the deepness and the reality of what is happening. And again, I mean, if you look at the entire structure all over again, this is Ukraine, borders Russia, and again, Georgia, Kazakhstan, and then of course, this is all of Russia. I was reading about Ukraine, and Ukraine, it has traditionally been over 1,000 years. It's been part of Russia. In fact, the word Ukraine means the new Russia. That's what Ukraine actually means. So traditionally, all of these countries pretty much part of the Soviet Union, and now this is the breakup. Not only did this happen, not only did the 15 countries actually split away, but something else also happened during the 1990s. And please remember, I showed you this particular map where countries like erstwhile East Germany, Poland, Hungary, Romania, they were all part of the Soviet influence, and something changed there also. And apart from the Soviet Union breaking up, the Eastern Bloc also broke up, and actually NATO became much more powerful. And this was NATO up until 1990s. and they started taking away, all these countries started joining NATO. Poland, Lithuania, Estonia, all erstwhile Soviet Union countries and influenced countries started joining NATO. So two things started happening simultaneously. And look at the list. In 1990, there were 16 members of NATO. After that, in 99, Poland, Hungary, Czech, all of them joined NATO. 2004, Bulgaria, Estonia, Lithuania, all joined NATO. 2009, Albania and Croatia joined NATO. Montenegro joined NATO. Bosnia, actually, if you look at post-1990, two things have happened simultaneously. 15 countries come out of Soviet Union, and the existing countries of Warsaw Pact, Eastern Bloc, almost all of them over 10 years start joining NATO. So much so that the last names to join were supposed to be Georgia and Ukraine were supposed to join NATO, which technically meant NATO troops, NATO missiles, NATO arms, NATO ammunition, NATO nuclear missiles would then be on Ukrainian soil. And that's the last line after which the Russian country starts. And this has been going on for almost 2 decades, where the NATO expansion has literally reached the borders of Russia. And there has been tremendous amount of these discussions going on as to where NATO should stop. There was always this discussion that beyond a point, NATO will not expand. But the expansion kept happening. As countries kept deciding, they started to join NATO till one day in 2014, something happened. And by the way, this war that we see in 2022 has not started in 22. It actually started in 2014. And that's what we will discuss now. But I wanted to set the tone that something triggered off this current conflict. Its history is deep-rooted. There are reasons for it. There is no justification for a war, but we must understand that something must have gone wrong terribly. And it's literally when the NATO, let's say the NATO setup literally reached Russian borders is when all of this erupted. And I'm going to show you a couple of slides which will give you an idea. Crimea got annexed by Russia in 2014. And this is where things really started to turn hot. The current president of Ukraine, Zelensky, that we all keep hearing about, was not the president in 2014. In fact, in 2014, there was another democratically elected president who was removed under a coup by Zelensky and his team. It was a coup that was created and Zelensky was installed. And as soon as he came into power, from 2014, he's been asking for NATO to come into Ukraine and be part of the NATO security system. And if you remember, something happened in 2014, and there was the Crimean takeover. There's something else that happened in 2014. There was a mini battle that was fought between Russian forces and Ukrainian defense forces. And if you remember, I'll jog your memory and take you back to this one event, which everyone will remember. There was a Malaysian airline flying over Ukrainian skies, which actually got hit by a missile that no one knows who fired, whether the Ukrainians fired or the Russians fired, no one knows. But the aircraft, it was a passenger airline, it fell down from the skies and all the passengers died. It was right in the start of the Ukraine-Russia conflict, because on the border areas of Ukraine and Russia, some parts wanted to be part of Russia and not be part of Ukraine. And that's when the actual conflict started, because Zelensky started asking for NATO presence. The Russians said, this is the red line. You cannot cross this red line, because finally, if NATO enters Ukraine, then motherland, that is the remnants of Russia, are at risk. And remember, the Russian psychology is still seeped into World War II, because no one remembers this, but in World War II, the maximum number of soldiers who died were Russian soldiers, because they are the ones who they had to bear the brunt of the German onslaught. And I don't want to get into too much of background and history. Perhaps in the question and answer session, we'll get into that, how actually a lot of what happened with the Jews emanated from Ukraine. And like, I don't want to muddle up too many issues out here, but keep it very simple. The Russians have not forgotten what happened with them in World War II. The Germans came right through Ukraine into Russia. Russia then drew a line saying that beyond this red line, no NATO presence will be allowed, because that can be a direct final assault into Russia. But the NATO establishment did not stop. And in 2014, they orchestrated a coup in which a democratically elected president was removed. Zelensky was appointed, and he asked for, like I said, for NATO's presence. So much so that a small war did erupt. In that war, this passenger airline was blown out of the sky. And the reason why I'm sharing all of this is used to remember that this is not started in 2022. This is now 7 years old. It's taken the Russians 7 to 8 years of talking and negotiating and trying to backpush this, and nothing happened. Finally, after which this red line was drawn. Crimea was, of course, annexed by the Russians in 2014. And now there are what really triggered off everything was when Putin formally recognized two particular regions, the Luhansk and the Donetsk regions, as separate countries altogether from Ukraine. He kind of signed this decree that said that these two regions are no longer part of Ukraine, because if you look at the map out here, and you see Luhansk and Donetsk pretty much into Russia, and that was created as a buffer zone, and then recognized by Russia as being part of as separate nations altogether. And all of this has been, like I said, I've repeated this, is that there has been 7 to 8 years just negotiating this, but clearly NATO didn't stop. And this is what NATO is all about. If you look at NATO, the composition of NATO is such that if you are a NATO nation and you get attacked, and now you saw the list, any name from Poland to Hungary, they're all part of NATO. If you are attacked, it is considered an attack on everyone. Hence, by definition, NATO protects the welfare and security of every other nation that is under its umbrella. So it is under Article 5, a NATO member, if attacked, then all these countries come together to repulse that attack. That is the formation of NATO. In 2014, the Ukrainian government made it a priority. It was the premise on which the government got formed, that they will join NATO. And then the real trigger came in 2019 in February, when actually the constitution was amended, where they were going to be allowed membership of the EU and NATO. It was kind of going to be put pretty much part of the constitution. That really triggered off all hell within the Russian security establishment. And then there were 2 years of negotiations of trying not to let this happen. But then, of course, as you can see, that clearly failed, and the Russians went all out to stop that to happen, which basically means that if you have crossed the red lines, then there are certain retributions. So that's a bit of a background. I also wanted to quickly share with all of you, like the point I was making as far as why is geopolitics so important to markets and to economic welfare of other nations and to our nation and to the world. I mean, you can just take an example of just this one example of gas. Virtually everything transports through Ukraine. I mean, Russia is a very, very large producer of gas. In fact, 50% of German gas requirements is still provided by Russia, but all of it passes through Ukraine. You can see the entry and exit points for gas transports, whether it's pipelines. So Ukraine, in that sense, is supremely critical, and so much so that the Germans, while they have sanctioned Russia, they've categorically said we'll continue buying Russian gas because the dependence is so large on Russian gas. And very weird, we'll talk about it separately, but I'll just give you an idea of how sanctions work out here. The Italians have sanctioned Russia, but they've said, you know what, all that is fine, but the Russians can continue buying our luxury items. Gucci and Prada can continue selling in Russia, but for everything else, there are sanctions. So Germans sanctioned, but we will continue buying oil. So it's a very, very convenient way of putting the sanctions and still, kind of keeping your business open. And that is something that I wanted to again make a point that while all of this has an economic impact, each nation, it seems as if it's too far out, something happening in some far land, but the impact is pretty much felt across the world. And there are the sanctions on Russia have had deep economic impact. Of course, there's a lot that has been spoken about it, etc., etc. But there are a couple that I want to share with all of you rather than getting into too much detail. The few that I want to share with you are, certainly there is this talk about payment of oil, perhaps in a different currency altogether, and not necessarily paying for oil in dollars. Now, this has happened only twice earlier in the history of the world, but it was not successful. And this time it is being attempted because the Chinese are backing it up. And there is this new world order could perhaps emerge where the Russians and the Chinese create this bloc, and the Americans and the Western bloc kind of are trying to grapple with it. But every 100 years, there is the emergence of a new world order. Perhaps we are in the middle of it. Perhaps there is a new world order getting created. All of that we will keep for the section where we can interact more. But I'm just sharing with you that each of these events now has a direct impact on our own economic successes or weaknesses. You all read what is happening with Visa and MasterCard. If as a Russian citizen, suddenly I cannot withdraw money, suddenly I don't get a credit card where I can use money, it is very debilitating. It is just think of it that India gets hampered by way of movement of money. What will happen to the markets? Do you know that for till day before yesterday, for over 10 days, the stock exchange in Russia was shut down. For 10 straight days, the stock exchange was shut down. For a person like me, who's fully invested in the markets and where my source of income is from the markets, it is most debilitating for me. I won't know what to do. I mean, you understand what I'm saying, that imagine that what your investors would end up saying, that for 10 straight days, the markets are off, what is happening? And it's not fantasy, it's all happened. And so we must appreciate the fact that matters of geopolitics, matters of national security are now perhaps the number one agenda of any government. It's no longer just a slogan. It's no longer token talk. It has a direct bearing on your and my life. And so some of these sanctions are working. Some of them are not working. What is not working is this whole assumption that that oil would actually become, sources of oil are so limited that the West, even after sanctions, has not been able to find a solution to Russian oil. And like I gave you the German example, where the Germans are forced to buy oil from the Russians. The Russians approached India with subsidized 25% lower, etc., etc. So suddenly, also what will happen is that alignments will get created. Countries will have to choose, and some countries will be neutral. And I'll speak about that in the next couple of slides. So that is as far as some of the economic sanctions are concerned. India's stand on all of this. A lot has been discussed on India's neutral stand. And people say, boss, neutral to kya hota hai? Na idhar ka, na udhar ka. My point is, no, boss, neutral is a stand. There is a yes, I stand with Russia. There is a no, I don't stand with Russia. And there is a neutral stand. I stand with neither. It is in the best interest of India to be neutral, because that has been a foreign policy that has worked. And let me explain to you how that has worked. If you look at the number one thing of being neutral, almost a month ago, we removed 20,000 citizens that were students. They kind of came off. If you do remember, there was a stop in the war for about 6 hours on both sides so that India could extract its students. It was simply because we didn't take a side. We didn't say that we are with the Ukrainians. We didn't say we are with the Russians. We said we are neutral. We don't take a stand, stop the war, but get our citizens out. That worked. Today, as far as defense is concerned, we continue to be amongst the largest, importers of Russian defense equipment. It's coming down very sharply. We're buying from France. We are buying from the United States. but 49 to 50% of our existing equipment still comes from the Russians. That continues. There's this particular defense equipment called the S-400 defense system, which is a protection against incoming aircraft. It is the most sophisticated defense system, and the Russians are giving it to India. There is also the Russian assistance as far as nuclear programs are concerned. And the Russians helped us at the time when the United Nations Security Council put up Kashmir as an issue. The Russians vetoed that. So I'm just giving you a bit of a color on the fact that it doesn't need to be a yes and a no. A neutral stand is a stand. And India's best interests are right now in a neutral stand. Having said that, I must explain this very, very clearly, that please look at what is happening with foreign policy in India right now. We are working with the Iranians. We are working with the Israelis, who don't see eye to eye at all. We are working with the Americans. We are working with the Russians, who don't see eye to eye. We are working with all of Middle East, which we just signed trade agreements. We are working with all of Southeast Asia. Suddenly, Sri Lanka is coming back into the Indian influence. Our work continues in the neighborhood. There is not a single state that we are not working with, except two nations, North Korea and Pakistan. Outside of that, India's foreign policy has been in the neutral stand, clearly demonstrated that whatever works for our strategic interests, we will go in that direction. Hence, by definition, we are working virtually with everyone. And it's not trying to say that we are taking sides. What we are saying, and I must explain this emphatically, that we have moved away from non-alignment to what is now known as strategic alignment. So it's a very, very two vastly different subjects altogether. Non-alignment was, I don't care what is happening. I'm not going to be aligned with anyone. In strategic alignment, it's very clear. I will align provided my interests are solved. So I think India's new course of thinking over the last 7-8 years has been strategic alignment. It's starting to shape up. And you can see that even in a war zone, taking a neutral stand has helped us out. So that's a bit of a background as far as India's stand is concerned. What I want to just kind of end with in all of this is the repetitive point that the economic angle to all of this is massive. It has deep ramifications on our industry. You can see what's happening as far as linkage between all of this and the markets is concerned. This is not stopping. It's only going to increase. In fact, if you look at COVID and if you look at what we thought will finish in 1 month has taken 2 years, it still continues. Having said that, we adjusted to it. We thought that the war will get over in 2 weeks because the Russians will get in and get out. It's taken over a month. Today, again, there are talks of peace talks, and first time there is a possibility of an end happening. And in all of these conversations, what is starting to come out very clearly is national security, geopolitics is starting to become the number 1 agenda of any nation, including a nation like India. So I'm going to stop here. I'm going to stop my share of the slides, but we'll come back to any of these. I'm going to just stop it here because this is pretty much what is happening as far as the nations are concerned. I'm going to stop here, open it up to question and answers, and in Q&A, I'll try and attempt to answer any of the specific matters that come up.
Okay. That was fascinating, I think. So if I can just start off, Karan, I mean, what you just mentioned that some sort of peace talks are there. So are you able to foresee the end game? I mean, in this, how you think,
Yeah.
You said very difficult, of course, like COVID, we saw that when COVID came, very difficult to visualize that it would continue for 2 years. But just what your thoughts are, what both the sides would try to do.
So Dhruv, you have to understand, one of the things I wanted to do was no one appreciates war. There's loss of life, and already there is a bill of $100 billion by way of loss of all of it within Ukraine. And remember, there are Russian soldiers dying as well. The fact that this came to a war was a very unfortunate incident, and that it was a provoked war. I think the point I was trying to make is, if you poke the bear in the eye, the bear will retaliate. This is what has happened in this in the current case. And I just want to take everyone back in history again. 3 years ago, under the Trump administration, none of this was discussed.
Correct.
Right? There was no talk of Russia and Ukraine. As soon as the Trump, and what were they focused on? They were singularly focused on taking the Chinese on.
Right.
Because the American domination is actually not threatened by Russia. It's actually threatened by the Chinese. And the economic domination is threatened by the Chinese, not by the Russians. As soon as Trump went and Biden has come back, the 20, 30-year-old legacy of the Cold War has come back and made its presence felt. And
Right.
that has been an absolutely disastrous foreign policy outlook by the Americans. So to answer your question, where does all of this end? You can see in today's negotiation, whatever has come out, Ukraine has agreed to neutrality. They will not join NATO. Ukraine has agreed to all of the annexation of Crimea by the Russians, the creation of the two regions. And they've said that any of our security requirements will be sorted out by the Russians, which is exactly what the Russians were asking for from day one. And the announcement has been that all operations in Kiev have already stopped. So who is the loser and who is the winner in this? You've got to really question the fact that as a leadership has to be questioned. And finally, in less than 1 month, it's coming back to exactly what was asked for.
Okay.
But the trust between the West and Russia is broken now for the next 10 years.
Right.
And the creation of new blocs is certainly going to take place. Because remember that Putin met Xi Jinping in the Winter Olympics, and right after that is when the attack happened. Remember, Xi Jinping has clearly said that in open terms that he wants Taiwan.
Right.
And the current Indian government has clearly said that they want Pakistan occupied Kashmir back. So each of the big leaders are making their moves. Right? I'm not saying that this is next to follow, but I'm just saying that there is a pattern to what is happening in the world. New blocks are getting formed. In the new blocks, non-alignment will not work, but strategic alignment will surely work.
Okay.
So, Karan, there are some questions which have come. These are related to markets and portfolios of client. So I will take, because I'll go chronologically as
Sure, absolutely.
So if you look at the question and answers, there is Senthil who has written, he's had 3 questions for you. I'll just read out. I think all the 3 are quite interlinked. First is, he writes, most of the HNIs and ultra HNIs look at equities, direct equities, PMS, MFs to manage their wealth. How they could bulletproof their portfolio for war impacts, assuming they are not hedging their portfolios. Second is the currency devaluation, how to protect the portfolios when the currency is devalued by 5 or 10% due to the reasons. And keeping cash in portfolio is a double whammy. Your inputs, please. Yeah. And the third one is, if you could broadly give how you are allocating international investing in terms of percentage, it would be helpful.
I understand where he's coming from. The broad issue is, how do you take care of COVID? How do you take care of a war? How do you take care of regime change? Okay, this is where I will start from. I have been in the mutual fund industry for reasonably good enough time to understand good funds, not so great funds. But I trust only a financial advisor. I don't do anything alone. There are no direct investments of mine, neither in funds or in stocks. The number one thing to do to bulletproof your portfolio is to choose a good financial advisor. There is no doubt about it. Cannot do it alone. Even with that background, I cannot do it alone because there are emotional issues involved here. So if you want to bulletproof your portfolio, go to a good financial advisor because they keep you on the path. Second, even in these really tumultuous times, what we've seen is that the flow of money has actually made assets very expensive. And what I've learned in my experiences is that in the best of times, be most careful, because our portfolios have to last 10 and 20 and 30 years, not 10 months. And so some of the biggest mistakes happen in the best of times. If you really want to bulletproof your portfolio, stay away from everything that is fancy and everything that is sounding very, very good. It's a sure short way of losing money. And that's what I've tried to kind of imbibe in my own portfolios as well. And the third thing is, how do you protect yourself from devalue of currency fluctuation? There is no way out. You have to take part of the portfolio and invest it in dollar terms or in external currencies, because now so many options are available. You don't just have to buy the fund route, you can actually buy the stock directly. So 3 things: please choose a great, good financial advisor stroke distributor. Second, make sure that you don't make big mistakes in great markets, because that will hurt us for the next 10 years. Remember, 2007 mistakes finished off in 2018. It took 10 years to finish off that mistake. And third, please take some money out so that there is a little part of that composition sitting in foreign assets that doesn't get impacted domestically. Those are the 3 big ideas I would always suggest.
Thanks. There's the next question is from Dipesh Mehta. He writes, will the West get agitated if we trade in ruble instead of the dollars?
Oh, well, the last time it happened, 2 leaders were killed. That's Gaddafi was killed, and Saddam Hussein, we know what happened to him. But actually, both had initiated the discussion of not dealing in dollars. They wanted to deal in another currency. They didn't see too much years left within themselves. So Putin's attempting it again. Let's see what happens. But on a more serious note, I mentioned this in the start of my talk, that every 100 years, there's a change in the world order. Prior to the Americans running, let's say, as the supreme power of the world, guess who was running the world?
British.
The British. And prior to the British, there must have been another world order between the Spanish and the French. So every 100 years, there is a change. I'm not saying that this change is now upon us. I'm not trying to say that the Americans are a losing power and the Chinese are an ascending power. All I'm trying to say is that don't just form your opinion on what's happening between the Russians and the Americans. The real power story is what's happening with the Chinese. We've taken our eye off on that front. That's where all the power struggles are, because the economic might of the Americans is being challenged by the Chinese. And I must explain to the viewers out here, what is a superpower? There's a definition of what is a superpower. A superpower is a nation that can deploy its defense services or its army or its units anywhere in the world in less than 1 hour. And the only country that can do that today is the United States. The Chinese don't have that capacity at all. So clearly the Americans still continue to rule the world. They seem to have taken the eye off what's really happening with the Chinese, and they've again focused back on on an issue that seemed to have got sorted, which is the Russian. So the way I look at things right now, America is a strong country, but with a weak president, is where things are right now. Does it mean that the world order will change when it comes to the currency? The attempt is exactly that. That is how the first shifts of powers happen. That is what the attempt is.
So the next question is from Ashwin Sote. He writes, considering aggressive stance and reactions from Russia, could this lead to NATO expansion in the future to counter Russia?
Oh no, it's the exact opposite. It's the exact opposite. There's been a massive NATO expansion into all of Europe, right? What has happened is, I'll tell you what will happen now. Most countries will start going and asking for nuclear weapons, because the only deterrent is nuclear weapons. If the Ukrainians had some form of nuclear umbrella, it'd be tougher for the Russians to do what they've done. So 2 things will happen. First of all, the biggest beneficiaries will be American defense equipment manufacturers. So McDonnell Douglas, Raytheon, all of the aircraft producers will get tons and tons of new orders from different countries. By the way, that's already started. F-35 is now being ordered by Norwegians and the Finnish. Finland is asking for. So two things. One, defense contractors will make a lot of money because most countries will start asking for very high-end equipment. Second, the whole focus around nuclear weapons as a protection and the deterrence will also start. So there are these two things will start. I don't think NATO expansion towards Russia is pretty much, that story is over, because they've gone till where they could have gone. They're pretty much into Russia right now.
So there is a question by Mukesh Chotani. He writes, what's the possibility of a World War III and impact on Indian economy because of this war situation? How much China-Pakistan movement against India in the future?
Yeah, I think this is a great question. We tend to think of wars in terms of missiles, bullets, aircrafts, etc. I have a session that we have done separately, and this is, and maybe at some stage we should do that session. We are in the middle of World War III. We're not, it's not too far out. We're in it. We're actually in it. And surprisingly, in World War III, not a bullet has been fired. But there are 9 different formats of war that we are in the middle of. I'll just leave you with 3 examples. You'll understand what I'm saying. And like I said, we'll do a separate session if required. To Mukesh's question, 9 wars we are in the middle of. Cyber war, trade war, biological weapons warfare, water wars. We are in the middle of media wars. We're in the middle of psychological operations war. I've listed 6. There are 3 more. Semiconductor wars. So please don't think that it takes a bullet to be fired to start World War III. We are in the middle of it. In fact, you and me have experienced one of those wars, which is COVID, which is the format of a bio war. And the other that you and me face every day is media wars. Who runs the narrative? Who controls the narrative? What are you consuming? What's the message you are taking in and forming opinions? And I must share this with everyone. There is a $18 billion annual budget set by the Chinese to set the narrative for global media. $18 billion. So what you read in New York Times or Economist about a certain thought process, there is actual money spent on it so that when we consume it, we form an opinion. And so to answer Mukesh's question, is this going to start World War III, etc.? Not in the way you look at it, but in a format that we're already in. And that is why it's very, very critical for a nation to start protecting its interests.
So there is a discussion on will Russia is going to trade in dollars or Russia is going to trade with rubles. That question is again, it's a debate between 2 people, but
no, very interesting, Rupa, that all their current payments they made, so all their existing interest payments, loan payments, they've all made in dollars, all of them till yesterday. So there is no default in the true sense of what they're doing. However, what they've said, and so have the Saudis, what the Saudis have said that to buy my oil, you don't need to pay in dollars, you can pay in yuan. And what the Russians are saying, that you can settle your bills in rubles or for that matter, any other currency. So it's an attempt being made to counter dollars. See, remember that if you're under sanctions, it's not as if you can sit back and start taking all the blows. There are obviously some ways in which you will kind of change the narrative out here. They could never have done this if they didn't have the backing of the Chinese economic superpower. That's the point I'm making out here.
Sure.
This is, don't look at Russia and rubles. Look at what the Chinese are doing to support the Russians. That's the real story.
So there is Dilip Vardarajan who writes, do you see this decade belongs to us as far as returns are concerned? Can I say India's growth story is going to be superior to other markets?
So to Dilip, my answer is very simple. Go back and go back on the screen and do a search on the Chinese markets from 2007 to 2022. Okay, from the peak of the financial crisis on, I think it's negative numbers. They've not created wealth for their investors over 15 years. In the same frame, 2007 ka peak aap le lo, Indian markets ka, or aaj ka peak le lo, you see the wealth creation that has already happened. in Indian markets. So the simple answer to your question is, you don't have to look for the next decade. You've already got a last 20 years track record demonstrating that Indian companies have created wealth, even in such tough circumstances, because the balance sheets are neat, balance sheets are transparent. Entrepreneurs have created wealth for organizations. There has been rotation in the sectors, no doubt about it, but the markets have demonstrated wealth creation. So if you're not invested in India, you're actually going to create a big mess for your investors, is what I would think it to be. And some of the largest markets, Japanese markets, have not created wealth over the last 30 years. It's a 1% return. The Chinese, like I said, have actually de-returned. They've actually provided negative returns after being a superpower. In our scheme of things, we have the luxury of having access to 32 sectors in India. No country has that kind of access to sectors as much as the United States and India. So if you pick the right advisor, if you pick the right 32 stocks, your generational wealth is almost guaranteed, provided we don't do silly mistakes. And the only mistakes we tend to do is get swayed in really, really good times. Avoid that, it's wealth creation.
Karan, there's Amit Vaidya who writes, few years back, we used to say New Age war is going to be fought away from war zone grounds, but we now see a typical war being fought. Do you see this war escalating to World War III and ending with the use of a nuclear war?
No, but boss, agar ye tha, Amit, think about it. It's now we are 30 days into this conflict. By now, all of NATO should have come to the support of Ukraine, no? And it should have escalated. It should have gone beyond control. It should have the whole world should have been involved by now. Nothing of that sort has happened. Except talk. Oh, we support you, go and fight. We will provide you with a javelin and a anti-tank missile. The Ukrainians wanted, please shut down the skies. By shut down the skies, meaning no Russian aircraft can fly in. That has not happened. The Ukrainians asked for NATO's army to come in, and nothing has happened. So this question doesn't arise of it escalating into something known as a nuclear war, because there is no involvement of a nuclear structure out here. And which is exactly what the Russians have been saying, that you cross a certain red line, I will not allow that. So I'm just leaving this thought with all of you that nuclear red lines are a different world altogether, which is why most refugees have walked into Poland. And Poland is a NATO country, literally 10 kilometers away from the borders, but not a single missile has dropped into Poland. If that were to happen, it is an attack on NATO and there is retaliation, but nothing of that has happened. So, and also we tend to think of wars, like I said, in terms of bullets. Now that story is also very, very rare. It's happened in this case, rare. But don't think we need a bullet to start a war. We're in the middle of it already.
So I don't know.
So if I can just come in. So Karan, instead of bullets, so the way it is turning out is you're using sanctions, economic sanctions. I mean, your economic power, you're fighting the war in a way with that, Is that right? Is that
absolutely right? I will give you some examples, Dhruv, of now you can connect the dots and see what I'm saying. The Australians simply asked one simple question. They said, can the world come together and see the origin of COVID? Ye kahan se nikla? That's all they said. You can go back and check all the statements. Can we do a check on where did COVID emerge from? And you can see what the Chinese have done to the Australians. Almost 100 items have been put under economic sanction. Basically, the duties have been moved from 5% to 200%. So Australians used to export meat, wine, etc. If it cost, let's say $10, now it's costing $100. So that's an economic war that the Chinese unleashed on Australia. Okay. I will give you another example of this, what you're saying. Again, if you look back in literally a year ago, Australian banks, then it's official news. Australian banks, Australian power companies, Indian banks, Indian power companies in Bombay shut down for 6 hours, 8 hours. They both said we came under a cyber attack.
Okay.
Very deep in Australia. In India, Bombay came under a power outage for 6 hours about 6 months ago. Right. And then they did this entire study and they reported we came under a cyber attack. One of the most prominent banks reported that it had to stop operations in India for about 3 to 4 hours. These things are not unrelated. That was a cyber attack. The point I'm trying to make is that the new formats are such that we think it's not affecting us, but it hurts us every day. And the one is COVID, where 2 years economic impact has hurt India. We've lost lives, etc., etc. Now, how do you protect yourself against these new formats is what the current government needs to focus on, what other governments need to focus on, because this has material impact on our lives going ahead. And in the other session, whenever we have the time, that's where I explain how is India tackling these 9 wars.
9 wars.
Yeah, there are 3 massive shifts that have happened in India's thinking over the last 8 years. And I don't want to get into that now, but the 9 wars are being tackled very, very successfully in 3 different formats.
So Karan, so Dhruv, I'll just read the questions. So GB Iyer writes, under the current leadership in India and given world's hostile environment, do you see India's structure or importance going up substantially?
Yes, I do see that happening, and I don't see that. I'm not answering this question as a patriotic Indian. I'm answering this question as a person who's looking at the world and seeing where do we fit in. Now, if the world has to take, if the Americans have to take on the Chinese, what is the counterbalance in Asia?
India.
Only India.
Yeah.
And if the world has to make sure that the Russians don't really go out of hand, what is the only other large nation that can come in to solve all of this? I'm not giving ourselves too much importance. What I'm just saying is that the need for India to step in and be a counterbalance to a lot of these polarized countries is going to happen, which is where the neutral stand comes in. And so in many ways, the point I'm making is that the importance of India will not be to take sides, but to perhaps be counterbalances to some of these world powers, which is why India joined Quad, which is why India has started. If you look at what's happening in our neighborhood, you look at today's morning's paper, pick up the Times of India, and you'll see India has sanctioned a $1 billion loan to Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka the economic mess in Sri Lanka is now known to all. They don't have money for anything because they took financial aid from the Chinese. Right? So the world is beginning to realize, you won't believe this when I say it, but the world is beginning to realize the complexity with which the Chinese have literally owning the world right now, and they don't like it. They just don't like it. So they need a counterbalance to all of it. India fits in well. And we've not made too many enemies. I think the real issue is that we have a vast list of friends. We don't have too many enemies, except the 2 names I took.
Yeah.
So
okay.
just if I can add on to this topic, that whether India benefits or not, but what you mentioned is the possibility of the emergence of, say, another bloc, a dominant bloc, whether Russia and China combine. So over the last 2 decades, what we've seen that economic prosperity has been driven by one big factor has been the globalization. As countries became, in an environment post the breaking of the Soviet Union, and maybe sort of improvement in relations between Russia and the West, trade sort of improved. And you had globalization across the globe, interdependence in terms of trade. And, China exporting a lot of stuff to US. That, along with the whole pieces of, offshoring, like where India was a beneficiary, you started exporting services. So in a way, do you see that like what India has been saying, Atmanirbhar?
Yes, yes.
movement from globalization to self-reliance, sort of
Yes.
the
Yes.
pendulum sort of swinging to that, and the impact it could have?
In fact, Dhruv, that's a great question. In the broad strategic terms of global shifts, this is one dominant theme where consumerism and export dominated countries, or for that matter, expansion, is now shifting in, not just in India. Actually, the Chinese have also started that, where they're saying that we cannot forever rely on exports, and hence domestic consumerism, domestic consumption has to go up. And exactly what the Indians have been saying, that Atmanirbhar, not just as far as consumerism is concerned, but manufacturing. And this is where I'll kind of just set the tone a little bit realistically. We cannot match up with Chinese manufacturing for a variety of reasons. Doesn't mean that we cannot be manufacturing. I'll give an example. We don't make footballs, we don't make garments, we just don't do low-end manufacturing. But we are extremely good at high-end manufacturing. For example, the BrahMos missile. Now it's going to get exported to the Philippines, Vietnam, and few other countries. For example, some of the defense equipment, helicopters, etc. Indian CAD/CAM solutions, Kalyani, Forge, etc. The solution around auto industry. So very high-end manufacturing is where India has done remarkably well, but very low-end manufacturing, we've just lost the battle. But who is winning the battle is not China anymore. It's Vietnam.
Yeah.
So so what is happening? The world is now beginning to explore alternatives to China, because that 30-year run ended with COVID. They said, boss, agar ye kal COVID fir se ho gaya, how can I be dependent on Shanghai, which is shutting down today? So the world is looking for manufacturing outlets. We will participate in it, but we will not be a dominant power. There will be other powers that will emerge. Having said that, our dominance may end up in some high-end manufacturing, for example, some of this defense equipment. So internal consumption, Atmanirbhar, is now perhaps a strategic shift for the globe. It's not just going to be an Indian theme only.
Okay.
And as financial advisors, one of our big stories will be for the next 2 decades or 10 years or 15 years, find those mega stories where domestic consumption, domestic manufacturing can actually, which is why you're seeing what is happening with some manufacturing names. No, suddenly the whole story has shifted from financials to manufacturing. You can see that happening in our markets as well.
So the next question is from Amit Vaidya. A few years back, we used to say, I think it's the same one which I wrote.
Yeah.
Ashwin writes, historically, we have seen so many wars, and we have also seen the financial markets rebound remarkably after the end of it. But this time there has been a tussle between the two countries directly, but indirectly many countries are involved. How would this conflict affect the global trade, and what can be the impact on us?
So let's just understand, leave this conflict for a minute. Just keep the conflict aside for a minute and look at what's happening in financial markets. And the biggest worry has been the printing of, just pure printing to get out of 2008 and get out of COVID. So in the last 15 years, or certainly in the last 2 years, the amount of money that has got printed is unparalleled in the history of humankind. So we are not just dealing with a COVID or a Ukrainian war. We're actually dealing with the problem of printing. And in printing comes inflated assets. And inflated assets, if the assets are inflated and we buy into them, they won't deliver returns for the next 20 years. So to answer your question in another way, don't worry of some of these other issues. Worry about the fact that too much money has got printed, too much money chasing too few assets right now. And it seems as if this will continue, but to bulletproof your portfolio, you have to buy assets that look reasonable and that can last the next 10 to 15 years. So I would be very, very careful, even if the war were not happening. Even if COVID had not hit, this is a time to be extremely careful with portfolios. This is not a great time to be taking mega bets. Small is beautiful. Existing is great.
Yeah.
Good managers with 20-year track records is the real story. please do not take pangas with money. It's not I mean, I would be very careful right now.
Sure. So Amit, Vaidya again writes, but do you really believe that Ukrainians have that much power to continue the war for 30 days? Do not you feel that the NATOs are helping Ukrainian without declaring it?
Of course, they are helping. वो तो हो ही रहा है, but then it's finished, right? I mean, yesterday the peace deal, etc. Turkey. So 35 days, it's not going to end right now. I mean, it's probably take another 15 days. Of course, the NATO, and see the Soviet Union went into Afghanistan, spent years out there, and finally got out because of the Stinger missiles that the Americans provided. It took them 7 years. Now, a 30 days too short a window to decide, but the Ukrainians are already talking about all of what was the original issue. So NATO has provided the equipment, but that's about it.
So Dipesh Mehta writes, if India joins NATO, will it not benefit if Pakistan attacks us? Should India not join NATO?
Okay, this is one thing I must amply make clear. We've spoken for about an hour now. There's not a single mention about Pakistan in this conversation for the simple reason that it is the most irrelevant, immaterial nation. It just so happens to be a neighbor. If you look at what has happened in the last 7 or 8 years, the conversations around Pakistan don't exist now. We only talk about taking China on. Right? That albatross of having Pakistan around our necks has been removed. So is the last thing that bothers any Indian thinker or policymaker is how to deal with Pakistan. That story is no longer, as I speak, I did mention that the guy who's spoken most anti-India, Imran Khan, is no longer in power. So again, from our point of view, we take on the Chinese, we work in competing with them. Pakistan's become pretty much an immaterial, irrelevant nation for all practical purposes. NATO cannot be our story because remember, we are for strategic alignments. We are not taking sides. NATO means we're taking a side. So to answer that question in any other way, no, we will not take sides. We are not like that. It is strategic alignment and NATO is not the solution here. We don't need NATO to protect us.
So Ashok Jairaj writes, in spite of China's export dominance for decades, why their markets delivered negative returns or no returns?
There is a complete, my God, I can speak for hours on this. But remember one thing, that nowadays I'm jobless and unemployed. So I spend tons of time on this TV back out here, just studying and reading. And this is a question that fascinates me no end, that here is an economic power, massive superpower, which has really done remarkably well, taking people out of poverty. Anyway, we can go on. And yet it's delivered zero on markets. For the simple reason that if the party decides to take a decision, it has a direct impact on the markets. For example, what they did with tech companies, or for that matter, what they did with real estate companies. Overnight, they wanted to prove a point that the CCP politicians, the Politburo runs the country, not Jack Ma. And there was, in real terms, it's almost a $4 trillion wealth destruction story out there in IT. $4 trillion. If you talk to a Chinese investor, they have no place to run. And I mean, I can go on and on about it. Fact of the matter is that there is just so much intervention of the Politburo that it's virtually impossible for promoters and entrepreneurs to work in an environment. And certainly now, where they've made it amply clear as to who runs China. And that is where the issue is.
So Rashmi
sorry, can I just add? I think,
sure.
I think what the point that all of us should therefore keep in mind is that it is very difficult to predict market returns based on GDP growth.
Yes.
Second, what Karan has pointed out, that we must be cognizant that the world order can change, economic power changes over 100 years. And I think, therefore, keeping in mind that market returns are more closely related to the underlying fundamentals in a capitalist environment. India may not be fully capitalist, but India is not communist. And I think the market economy works in a sort of a capitalist, sort of society that one needs to keep in mind. The second, I think, is Karan mentioned about diversification. I think all of us need to ensure that even though we have a strong belief in India, I think it is prudent to diversify our investment across, geographies. And today, if you see broadly, US is the biggest dominant power. We don't know whether China will emerge. So it might make prudent, even though China has not done well, you allocate some money to some of the other countries other than US, and you have a significant portion in India on the India growth story.
Yeah.
So I think keeping this mind that what Karan alluded earlier is that geopolitics or COVID, what it has shown is that it impacts economy, and it therefore also impacts our investment.
Line of thinking, yeah.
Yeah. And I think we must keep that in mind. And I think diversification is one answer in a way to reduce the risk. Yeah, sorry, Rupa, I just thought I should add.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely. I just want to add something. Maybe I didn't speak about it much because we don't give ourselves enough credit for one piece, which is truly amazing in our country. See, the question asked was about China and wealth creation. Now, I can have a certain political ideology, and Dhruv can have a certain political ideology, and Rupa can have a completely different political ideology. And all three of us and every person on this call gets to choose our ideological partner every 5 years.
Right.
Hence, by definition, you can kick out or invite someone to be the ruling party.
Right.
So there is a pressure cooker that gets built, but every 5 years it gets released. But in China, that doesn't happen. If you don't like a certain disposition, you don't have a choice but to accept it. And these small sprouts keep happening as to what's, how to get rid of it. So I'm just saying that the democratic electoral process in India helps keep sanity going. It allows us our freedom. And perhaps it has in some ways, it has an impact on what's happening in the markets as well. I'm not saying that the government helps create money. No, what I'm saying is that the entrepreneurs, even if they have different ideologies, can continue working because it is allowed out here.
So I think I don't know if Ms. Rashmi Shah has a statement or it's a question. He says China has already started water war.
Absolutely.
Then the next question is, please, I think you have highlight on the.
Rupa, if you don't mind, there are two questions that I just noticed, which are important, and I'll take those two. There is a question from Ketan, and there's one from Santosh on the Q&A structure.
Yeah.
I'll take Santosh's question first. Will Quad ever be a security alliance like NATO? That's one. Will Quad be NATO? And will the Dragon shift focus to India instead of Taiwan in terms of will the Chinese Dragon shift focus? So these are Santosh's questions. Quad is not NATO. Definitely Quad is not NATO. In fact, the last thing Quad is a security alliance. Quad is coming together for economic matters and defense. So Quad and NATO are very, very struck. In fact, the entire structures are not built on defense alliances. So Quad is coming together for economic alliances, and it's coming together for movement of money. And if required, there will be security alliances. The question on the Dragon focusing on India and not on Taiwan. The Dragon actually is in a bit of a, they've taken on all of Asia. You tell me one country that the Chinese are not at loggerheads with. You name one nation. They're fighting with the Philippines. They're fighting with the Taiwanese. They have issues with the Japanese. They don't like the South Koreans. They have territorial issues with Vietnam. I can challenge anyone on this call to name one Asian country that they don't have issues with. And where does this entire structure come and stop? At India's borders. So the only nation that can take on this entire giant is actually finally India. So it is not in the Chinese interest to take on the Indian establishment, because man to man today, if you may not believe this statistic, but there are 200,000 troops seeing man eye to eye, 200,000 troops each side in Ladakh and in all of that area, which is where the Chinese dragon has come and stopped. So to take on will require tremendous amount of effort. It's not easy, which is where there are now these gestures where the foreign minister has come yesterday. The Chinese foreign minister came to India talking peace, etc., because they understand where it all stops. And remember, the Chinese are at loggerheads with 30 countries in Asia. And that is where India starts to portray its influence. And which is the next question asked by Santosh, that what happens between India and Nepal? Just like India started supporting Sri Lanka and Sri Lanka is coming back to India for its help, exactly the same thing is happening with Nepal. Exactly the same thing, because the Nepalese realized that the Chinese are intruding into their space, in fact, asking for territory. It is through map and cartography, and the Nepalese establishment is starting to reestablish its ties with India all over again. So the point I want to leave everyone with is what you see in the news, and sometimes the reality can be very different. And there are these back channels that seem to be operating where the Indian influence in its neighborhood is starting to come back.
So, Karan, there is a question by Satya Narayan. If you can read that, just about, it's about oil.
Sorry, where exactly is that?
It's about
Okay. Libya, Yemen,
Yeah.
US wants to have say on oil now. Ukraine and US failed without attacking. But for whether currency will still what? So this question is the foundation of this question is oil. Okay, let me answer this in another way. Do you know one country which is not dependent anymore on external oil?
Venezuela.
One more name. Surprising name. It's in that list.
I know.
Surprisingly, it's the United States.
States.
So the United States is no longer a country that actually looks out for its energy requirements, because they started what is known as fracking. This technology that they've adopted has allowed them to explore oil and keep prices low as to where they want it to be. So it is not, the Americans are not fighting this for oil any longer, which they used to in the 80s and the 90s. The entire Middle East problem was let's say oil, but that's not the issue today, because the American demand for oil has come down and they don't really look for external sources. Of course, the cost of fracking is very high, but the demand has come down. The real reason for all of what you see is what I would call as who dominates the world. Which country rules the United Nations, the WHO, the IMF, the World Bank, which currency is used for trade, etc. And that is where I come back to the original point that all of this is 80% in dollars. 80% of all institutional arrangements are run by the Americans, but it is getting challenged by the Chinese. And that is where the focus should be, rather than what is happening with the Russians. And I'm just going to kind of explain this in one last 30-second way, that in this current disposition of the current establishment of the Biden government, they actually took their eye off China and focused on Russia. That's where things have gone wrong.
Correct. So I think I'll read the last, because others are all, I think we have mostly answered. The last one where Mamta Rao writes, the economies of our country, neighbor countries are in trouble. How do you see that as a threat to us with how China is involved there, the financial wars?
Yeah, massive financial wars. There is this fantastic report I read of how the Belt and Road Initiative is a $300 billion debt that the so many parts of Africa and Asia now, they've taken on $300 billion of debt, cannot pay it. Classic example is Sri Lanka. Classic example is what's happening with Hungary. Classic example, what's happening in parts of Kenya, where they've taken on Chinese debt, allowed them to create a belt and a road and a train, etc., but they cannot pay for it. The Chinese come in and take land. It is literally जैसे वो साहूकार होता था विलेज में, अगर तुमने मुझसे पैसे ले लिए और पैसे नहीं वापस करी तो जमीन मेरी. Literally that has happened. But the good news, and please remember, okay, this is where I will kind of explain it as simply as possible. The Chinese have played that card for 30 years now. The Americans have played their cards for 30 years now. But we're still to play our cards. Our cards are still getting, dealt. So the world now knows about the Chinese debt. The world knows about Chinese supply chain. The world knows about bioweapons. The world knows about what is happening as far as manufacturing is concerned. And it is readjusting. You won't believe this, but the Italians and the Germans are the biggest supporters of China. Even they have turned against China in free trade agreements. Something really dramatic is happening in the world right now. In 10 years, supply chains will look completely different from what they are today. So to answer that question, that our neighborhood is in trouble, etc., true, but all of those cards have been played. In fact, the reversal of those cards is starting to happen now.
So I have a question, Karan, saying that if we are major exporters of oil, correct? And with this war, I think oil, of course, we bought oil from Russia at a concessional rate and all of those, but that's for the time being. How are we going to sustain as a country over the next few years and handle this oil crisis that we always have faced?
Absolutely great question. And Rupa, I think that pretty much sums up our biggest national security threat is this thing.
Yeah.
Is the dependence on oil, and also the fact that it contributes to our largest export bill. So forever we are struggling with kabhi 100 rupees, kabhi 50. When we are forever in that dilemma, the only way out is what is happening by way of. So there are two things a country solves for that. One is strategic reserves, where you buy it in bulk and park it somewhere, and not necessarily onshore. You park it in other parts of the world, and you buy strategic reserves. At good times you buy it, in low power you buy it. The other thing is the revolution around electric. And the Chinese are leading that revolution by way of the conversion from petrol to electric, but the Indians are not behind right now. And the biggest change will come when the battery costs start to come down sharply. This conversation 3 years ago would have been a null and void conversation. We wouldn't have even discussed it because the cost of battery in electric vehicles was the highest.
Yes.
But that is fast coming down. And if you look at the current government's focus on electric vehicles and what is happening with manufacturing, in 7 to 8 years, perhaps even 10 years from now, if 30 to 40% of new cars that are coming into production become electric, your dependence on oil, etc., starts to come down. And which is why the war for Ukraine, because the largest sources of battery components, thorium, etc., are found in Afghanistan and in Ukraine, which is what the Chinese want.
Oh, okay.
So it is an investment for the future through the Russian route to lower the dependence on oil so that you can create so that the entire ecosystem around electric vehicles can be created. So that's where the world is a slightly complicated place, but India is pretty much part of that whole structure where the shift has already started to happen. That's the only long-term solution, no other way out.
So when you say that the trade wars will change and the whole dynamics will change, you just made a mention saying that even Afghanistan has some metals, correct,
Yeah.
which are precious metals, which they have. Because they themselves cannot sustain it, Afghanistan. So would Chinese influence them to a larger extent and say that how do they will exactly like they would invade?
So, when we do the session on the 9 wars, I have a session specifically on this as to supposedly the Chinese influence on the Afghans. I mean, it's fascinating that you have the entire Taliban cabinet that went to China, met the foreign minister there, Wang Yi, got clicked, and all 9 of them are designated terrorists.
Correct.
So it's just how the world is moving right now. Each country wants its domination, and 80s, 90s, 70s were all about dominating the sources of oil. 2010, 2030, 2020, 2030, 2040 will be sources of, the real sources that will be dominated are where do you get semiconductors from and who gets the battery components. The real war is on semiconductors and electric batteries. So the next 30, 40 years are all about that. And by the way, see what the government has done with the Tatas. They've spent they're wanting to spend 10 to 15 billion dollars PLI so that semiconductor manufacturing starts in India. It's unbelievable that as a nation which consumes so much, we just don't have a semiconductor plant in India. Unbelievable.
Great. I think we've answered most of your questions, Karan. If I have missed something, if you can have a look at it, I think we've covered everything.
Yes. Yeah. I think we've covered a lot, and we'll probably do a follow-up on, like I said, on the 9 wars at some point.
Absolutely.
It's an unending topic, I think.
Yes, it is, and it affects us all. It affects us all.
Yeah. So great, then. So Rupa, just want to do the thanks and.
Yeah, thank you, Karan. Thank you for this absolutely amazing session. And I have to thank you because when I called you up and you called me back from Paris to just speak to me, and I was just, I was overwhelmed, and I told Dhruv, I said, Karan has called me from Paris, he's on a holiday, and he did attend the call. And thank you for giving us this opportunity. And I'm sure that everybody on this call would be benefited and would, of course, there's, as Dhruv said, it's a huge, in the sense, it's a Pandora box to learn, because I was never interested in history, but as you speak, I think I'm not able to understand it much better. And thank you so much. And in the future, I am sure that we're going to have the 9 wars and the influence of China. So we'll definitely work on, I'll speak to you, and we'll do it in the next months together.
Definitely.
Thank you so much once again. Thank you.
Yeah, Rupa, I must add, not only the importance of history, but history and geography. That's
geography too.
How it affects us into our daily lives.
Yeah.
So thank you for a very insightful and I think enlightening session, Karan. Thank you very much.
No, I actually want to also be genuinely grateful for taking the risk of calling someone like me, because traditionally I've been from the fund industry, but thanks for giving me the opportunity for talking to, and I do spend a disproportionate time studying all this these days. So आजकल में पढ़ाई लिखाई यही चल रही है. So yeah, I'm very happy to do the next session whenever you'll have the time. Happy.
And actually, Karan, when I was talking to Dhruv saying that every month when we have to call someone, I think I forgot. And then I called up Dhruv. I panicked and called up Dhruv, and I said, Dhruv, what do we do? So he said, there's war going on. And I think, who else than Karan? And that's how it happened.
Oops, actually demystifying. I think, demystifying, as you said, to know a little about the history. And unless you know history, what you gave, and the backdrop, it will help all of us in, when we engage with, whosoever, whether even with family and friends, I think. And of course, our clients,
Stay invested, stay well, and please work with financial advisors. That's the only way out.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Karan. Thank you. Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye. Thank you, everybody on the call, all the members. And okay.
Have a wonderful